All right, welcome back to second lesson here in chapter 32, the politics of boom and bust. Talking about the 1920s, we talked about in the previous chapter the cultural side. The last time that we were together, we talked about the Republican old guard, the break from progressive reforms. And today we're going to be talking about the actual politics in the 1920s and these administrations. So, without further ado, we're going to start off with section 2, the Harding years. This section was a highlight of the growth of business and the difficulties of your labor unions during the 1920s because, once again, it's a movement away from the progressive reforms. Looking on page 749, there's a law passed in 1924 called the Adjusted Compensation Act. What it did is it made big promises to World War I veterans. 20 years after the fact, after 1924, so now in 1945, it promised your World War I veterans that they would get a bonus of $1.25 per day that they were deployed fighting in World War I. And because of this, they are the only non-business group that realizes any lasting gains from World War I. And I say non-business because many businesses profiteered off of World War I. We'll talk about that later, but artificially inflating prices, so the federal government buying weapons and ammunition had to pay more and they made more money. That's why they're the only non-business group that realized significant lasting gains. Part B, internationally, America returned to its isolationist roots in the 1920s. Okay, got a little scenario for you. I got a toddler running around, so curious, loves everything. That's kind of America. America was kind of a toddler prior to World War I, running around, kind of stumbling in everything, happy-go-lucky. We think life is good. And that curiosity sometimes gets the better of us because when Dad is opening an oven door, cooking a brisket, 425 degrees, got to sear it first. I open up this door, and toddler America says, "Ooh, what's that?" The hot oven door represents all the hardships of World War I. And this hasn't happened, thankfully, but toddler runs over and slaps his hand on because he's so curious that's inside. What's Dad doing on the inside of this oven? And he hits the oven door, and before he can even do anything, he's going to react. His mind hasn't even processed yet. The reaction is the recoil, the pullback of the hand because it's massively painful. Okay, and that example, that is America's reaction to World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations. It's just a retraction. This world is a horrible place. World War I was horrible. The League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles was all bad. We want to go back to isolationism and cutting ourselves off from the world. Okay. And then the 1920s is the year of crying, the decade of crying and realizing, we had a lot of pain, but we don't actually realize it until 1929 because of the stock market crash. So moving on, not being part of the League of Nations, and business people were unwilling to help pay for a larger U.S. Navy, the country signed a series of disarmament treaties, including the 1922 Nine-Power Naval Treaty. Okay, this is going to limit the amount of battleships and aircraft carriers that nations can have. And it should have rightfully been called the Eight-Power Naval Treaty because Japan almost gets a pass. Moving on, that limited British and Japanese war tonnage at a ratio of 553. Look in the reading for what the ratio actually means. That it's basically how big of a warship you can build when it comes to battleships and aircraft carriers. Destroyers, submarines, not included. They're not in the restriction. It's an effort to de-escalate militarism after the war without actually being in the Treaty of Versailles. It also stated Americans would refrain from fortifying their far eastern possessions, including the Philippines. Not just limited to the Philippines, but the Philippines are included. And this is foreshadowing. Think about this nine-power treaty. We're saying no more militarization. The war's over, not this big a deal. We don't have to think about war in the future. And so we're not going to fortify the Philippines. We're not going to fortify Guam. We're not going to fortify any of these eastern areas because we don't want to portray militarism in the Pacific. Okay. And with this, the foreshadowing piece is because we did not fortify any of our holdings in the Pacific, it's going to be really easy for Japan to take them in World War II. And some of you might be going, wait a second, Far Eastern possessions, isn't that west of the United States? Yeah, in terms of the globe, we're still looking more like European Central. And so to the far east would be the Philippines, and to the west would be the United States. Kind of a Eurocentric comment there. The Japanese were not subject to such restrictions in their possessions. They continue to militarize. They continue to build up. They continue to expand. In part, Harding was willing to push for this disarmament because the American businessmen, taxpayers, were not willing to pay for a larger U.S. Navy. There's no need for it. The war is over. Why do we need a Navy? I'm not willing to pay for that. Nobody wants more taxes if they don't have to pay taxes. And so many Americans are not willing. The businessmen are not willing to pay for a larger Navy. And this kind of helps. Hey, we're gonna reduce our militarism, and at the same time, we're going to lower our Navy because nobody wants to pay for it. Part C. Later in the decade, the idealistic Kellogg-Briand Pact. Okay? Kellogg is not spelled like the cereal here. It's Kellogg. Supposedly outlawing war was signed. Beautiful idea in theory, horrible idea in practice. Like many things that you're going to see from this time period, it was idealistic. Nations signed in that they're not going to use war as an international means of diplomacy. We're not going to threaten warfare. We're not going to build up armies and threaten people. All that led to World War I. We're not going to do it. If a country becomes belligerent, I'm going to warmonger. I'm going to threaten war to everybody. It's the other signatories, everybody else that signs into the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It's their job to stand up and say, hey, dude, shush, knock it off, cool down. Let's go over here. Let's take a breath. Let's figure out what's wrong and use it as a tool of diplomacy to talk out world issues. So in essence, the Kellogg-Briand Pact is kind of the League of Nations outside of the League of Nations. It's the United States trying to do something along the lines of the League of Nations, but not actually joining it. Higher American tariffs temporarily helped American business, but hurt European enemies by trying to recover from the devastation of World War I. Got to understand, Germany, Austria, broken up into multiple nations, England, France, all of their economies are ruined by World War I. Everything they did for 4.5 years was geared to war. Automotive industry, nope, not producing automobiles. We're producing war goods, whether that is vehicles for war, but we're not producing any luxury items here. And so they have to completely retune their economy, which is very, very costly. And many of these industries aren't going to survive. Understand, too, that when the United States puts on a tariff, they're not making a ton of money, and whatever we're taxing them through a tariff is cutting into their profits. Not wanting Europe to flood American markets with cheap goods after the war, Congress is going to pass the Fordney-McCumber tariff law in 1922. Going to raise tariff rates pretty blanket across the board from 27 to 35. So just over a quarter of what it's worth to just under a third of what it's worth. Okay, so raising tariffs from about 25, about a quarter to just over a third. So not a huge increase, but enough that it's going to discourage Americans from buying this cheap stuff coming out of Europe and competing with the established American market. And then in 1930, we're going to pass the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which is going to raise tariff rates to as high as 50%. So we go from 1922 saying about a quarter to a third. Now we're going to go up to a half of whatever it's worth. So if it's a $100 product, the tariff is going to be $50, and that's going to be relayed on to the customer. So you're going to pay $150 for whatever that good is. And that's going to really cause many Americans to say, I don't want to buy imported stuff because I'm going to be paying so much more than if I buy American. And that's the intent, is to help out domestic market. However, in these fledgling markets in Europe that need people like the American economy to buy, It's going to stifle them. They're not going to make money. So what are they going to do? They're going to try to do the same to American exports, and they're going to tariff American exports, and they're going to tariff German exports, and they're going to tariff everybody. Everybody's tariffing everybody. And so nobody wants to trade with each other. Okay? Both President Harding and Coolidge were much more prone to increasing tariffs than decreasing. And this is true for the decade of the 20s. This is what the 1920s does economically. Put more tariffs on, more tariffs on, more tariffs on, more tariffs on, economic crash. This precedent is a problem, or this presented a problem. Europe needed to sell goods to the United States to get the money to pay back its war debts. Europeans responded by also increasing tariffs. How does the increase in tariffs for both the United States and European countries have a detrimental effect on the global economy? If I am going to raise tariffs on you and you're going to raise tariffs on me, I'm not as likely to trade with you, and you're not as likely to trade with me. My people are not as likely to buy your goods. Your people is not likely to buy my goods. So I'm going to send less your way. You're going to send less my way. I put more tariffs on you. You put more tariffs on me. I'm going to send less goods your way. You're going to send less goods my way, until we reach to a near stop where I might send a handful, and where I once was sending thousands of goods, now I'm going to send dozen or maybe less than a dozen goods. The international trade grinds to a halt by 1930 with the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Part D. Corruption was also exposed in the Harding administration, typified by Veterans Bureau head Charles R. Forbes, stealing $200 million from the government that was connected to veterans hospitals. That's pretty low. I don't know how you get much lower than taking $200 million from veterans hospitals for those that were injured and had long-lasting injuries after World War I. And Secretary of the Interior Albert B. Fall with the naval oil-related Teapot Dome. Fall allowed companies to go in and drill on naval lands and accepted money for doing it. Okay, these two major corruptions, these two major scandals are the two worst portions of Harding's presidency, and both of them are going to cause Harding much headache. All right. So both of these two corruption cases, both of these are going to earmark how bad the administration of Warren G. Harding was. After Harding dies on August 2nd, 1923, a new president is going to come in. We have a process for that, right? Though the president is unable to fill his duties. Death would be one of those things. He's not able to fulfill his duties, so the vice president's going to come in. He's flinty, he's conservative, he's morally straight, and that's huge because America needs morally straight after this massive corruption scheme in Warren G. Harding's cabinet. Calvin Silent Cal Coolidge from the state of Massachusetts. Yes, he's born in Vermont, but his political career is in Massachusetts. So Calvin Coolidge is going to be this quiet, reserved, conservative man that's going to take over for Harding and is going to restore a lot of faith in the American presidency because of his morally straight character. So part 3 here is Calvin Coolidge years. Farmers in the 1920s were in a depression state ahead of the rest of the nation because World War I ends and they continue to produce as though the war is still going on. They're not making any more money than they were during the war. On top of that, we have this massive supply increase because they have things like tractors they're able to afford. So they're producing more stuff, but there's less and less people to buy it because England and France don't need us to feed them anymore. So it's basic economics. Economics 101. More supply, less demand, lower prices. The more you make and the less people want it, the less you can demand of that price. And so that's how they destroy their own prices. Part B. Warren G. Harding died in office August 2nd, 1923, as we talked up above. And his successor, Calvin Coolidge, was dubbed Cool or Silent Cal. Man of very few words, very silent. He allowed other people to talk, and he responded with very concise, very eloquent responses. Welcomed all parties to present facts so that he could make concise and accurate decisions. Notably, President Calvin Coolidge refused to sign legislation twice proposing a federal government subsidized farm price. The McNary-Hagen bill sought to keep agricultural prices high by authorizing the government to buy crop surpluses and sell them abroad. President Calvin Coolidge vetoed this bill because they would cost the government a great deal of money. He's very fiscally tight. He doesn't want to spend a bunch of extra money. One of his favorite quotes, one of the things that I love about Calvin Coolidge, deals with what his view of taxes are. And if I can find it here, if you tax a man more than is absolutely necessary, it's legal theft or something to that degree. He talks about how even taxes in the federal government, it's wrong for the government to tax any more than is absolutely necessary. And that would be the case is if they decided to spend more money here with the McNary-Hagen bill to subsidize your farm prices, then they would be spending more money than they absolutely had to. So he says, no, it's not our job. Plus, it's not good for the farmer to have subsidized goods. They need to, in his eyes and the old guard ideas, they need to have good business practices. Furthermore, another attempt to help failing industry was the Norris-LaGuardia Act, intending to help unions, or as it's phrased in your book, organized labor. So this bill tried to ban yellow dog contracts. It said that companies cannot say, hey, if you're going to work for me, you cannot join a union. If you join a union and we find out about it, we'll fire you. That's a yellow dog contract. And this was shot down by Calvin Coolidge as well. And this signifies the difference between old guard Republican ideas and progressives. The progressives would have passed this in a heartbeat and said, yes, this is the way. We need to protect the people and the unions. Whereas old guard Republicans are now saying it's harming the U.S. industry. U.S. industry needs to recover, and we need to focus on these small businesses and foster them along. It's not the federal government to interject every little idea along the way. Okay. And so he's going to shoot this down, and he's not going to help out the unions. Part C here, just a little bit of context. You got to understand where all this is building. There's a lot of this is going to build into the Great Depression. There's some of this is going to build into World War II. And I know that's a lot of people's favorite chapter and favorite subject to talk about in American history. It's important to have a great understanding of the structure of post-war debt and reparations, because this contributes to the onset of the global depression and the rise of Hitler in Germany. Understand, the United States, England and France, and Germany had this debt triangle, and it was structured really good as long as the United States' economy was good. But the second the U.S. economy hiccups, the whole process comes crashing down. So if you look at the chart on 757, the U.S. insisted on getting its about $7.5 billion or so in war debts back from France and Britain. Although both France and Britain objected. They say, we should not have to pay these war debts to you because we lost so many more people than you. But the United States holds true and says, you will repay our debts because we gave you so much stuff before we even joined the war. Because they couldn't earn dollars back by selling goods in the United States, what was their main source of funds to repay these debts? Well, it's reparations from Germany. Germany had to pay reparations from World War I to England and France. Okay, so there's part one of this debt triangle. The United States has money that they should be getting from England and France, and we're demanding that they pay those. England and France are demanding money from Germany. And they're basically going to take money from Germany and just change it over and give it to the U.S. In 1929, Wall Street bankers are going to start calling back loans that they made to Germany in 1924 under what was known as the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan was our answer to the Treaty of Versailles. The United States said, we will give you private loans. We're not going to make you pay for reparations. We don't want reparations from you. We're going to give you private loans to help with your economy and with some of the reparations. So our bankers, our businessmen are going to give money to you with a little bit of interest down the line to help you pay the reparations to England and France. So we're giving private money to Germany. Germany's going to turn around and give it to England and France in reparations. England and France is going to turn around and give it back to the U.S. government in terms of war debt, and the U.S. government is going to give tax breaks to those that gave loans to Germany. It's this massive triangle that seems to work really good when we have everybody buying American goods, but as the 1920s wear on, nobody's buying goods. We're laying tariffs on each other. The economic triangle is slowing down, and when it gets to a point, many bankers say, I want my money back. Germany doesn't have the money because they've been paying it to England and France. England and France still want their reparations, and so it's going to actually pull Germany in two directions. Part 4, the Hoover years. In 1928, Republican Herbert Hoover defeated the first Catholic nominee Democrat Alfred E. Smith. Timeout. Where in the heck does Calvin Coolidge fit in this? Where'd he go? He took over for Warren G. Harding in 1923. He gets reelected in 1924. He doesn't run for a second term. Is he crazy? No, he hated it. He didn't like the presidency. He didn't like all the things that went with it. And he said, I will not run again in 1928. So that's where Herbert Hoover comes from. Democratic Alfred E. Smith is put up as his adversary. Hoover is pretty well liked. He supported isolationism, individualism, free enterprise, small government. He dots the I's and crosses the T's of the old guard Republican ideas. Other strengths, he has integrity. Keep in mind, he was a part of Warren G. Harding's cabinet. And he was not corrupt, even though he saw people being corrupt, and he stood firm. He is a man of integrity. He is humanitarian. He has a passion for looking for facts. He is efficient. He has the ability to inspire loyalty. And for the first time during the election of 1928, radio was used. Okay, the authors and the textbook and historians give a nod to Herbert Hoover here for using radio to help campaign. Yes, he still went out in person. He campaigned. He had big rallies, but he ran ads on radio because radio is free. Most people have a radio. They can listen to it. If they hear a name, there's some people that'll just vote for the guy because they're like, hey, I know that name. And while his rival, Alfred Smith, did not use radio. In 1929, the Agricultural Marketing Act, Hoover's going to pass, and he's going to try to make some strides. He doesn't do quite as much as the bill that Calvin Coolidge shot down, but he's going to try to stabilize some of these farm prices that are just plummeting in the late 1920s. And he's not going to try to keep them high. He wants farmers to stabilize a little bit. They're all over the place. Many farms are going bankrupt because they can't get any money. And soon afterwards, after the passing of the agricultural marketing bill, the Congress will pass the Hawley-Smoot tariff to try to protect American farmers because their prices need to be higher. It's going to cause less people to buy their goods, which actually drive prices down for farm goods even more. Once again, raising the average import duty to 50 or 60%. And so the Hawley-Smoot tariff really destroys international trade, especially agricultural international trade. Fun fact, Herbert Hoover was the first Republican candidate since the Civil War to win a state that seceded, giving him the term Hoovercrat. It's an enduring term. It's also kind of, if you're a true hardcore Democrat, it's also a term that says you voted for Hoover, you betrayed the Democratic Party. And then lastly for this section, what do the authors say on 760? That the tariff bill played directly in the hands of hate-filled German demagogue Adolf Hitler. I don't understand. Germany's in a bad spot. Our Great Depression's bad, but by 1925, Germany is already in the midst of their own Great Depression. They are not doing well, and it lasts longer than the United States Depression does, because the United States is giving loans, and then 1929 kind of pulls the reins back and says, hey, we need our money back from you. Don't be a deadbeat. Give us our money. And at the same time, reparations are being demanded by England and France, so they have no money. Money is worthless. And this economic isolationism, this desperation that the German people feel is going to drive them to anybody that has an answer. And Adolf Hitler essentially says, listen, we don't need the loans from America. They're not. Thank you to America. Tip that to America. But we don't need them. Now they're demanding them back with interest. We don't need them. We do not need England and France. They're just demanding and siphoning money off of the top of us. Germany needs to stand up. Germany needs to stand on its own 2 feet. Germany does not any longer need to be subjugated to be put second to any other nation. And that really gives him this powerful stance in the German people. And with that, we'll talk about the crash and depression the next time we get together. 5, 6, and 7 will be talked about then.